Hello and welcome back to Beyond the To-Do List, a podcast about productivity. I'm your host, Eric Fisher, and in this episode, I'm excited to share a conversation I had with Margaret C. Andrews. She's the author of the book, Manage Yourself to Lead Others, Why Great Leadership Begins with Self-Understanding. And Margaret is the founder of Mind and Hand Associates. She's on faculty at the Harvard Extension School. And in this conversation, we're talking about MYLO. And no, that's not M-I-L-O, it's M-Y-L-O. MYLO is a framework that's practical, science-based, built around motivation, learning, and opportunity, and essentially explains how leaders at any level can use it to grow. And in this conversation, she's sharing common blocks to that growth, the how and the why behind self-understanding and what to do with it, how to use that then to lead and manage upward as well as those around you, and be a better leader to those that report to you. We're talking all about how to get and give feedback, especially when sometimes it might be hard to hear or it might be vague, and how to use that MYLO framework to assess where you are and what's missing and what's next. So if you're looking to grow on purpose, Margaret's MYLO framework will help you navigate that growth without getting overwhelmed and give you some structure, some spark to move forward. Well, it is my privilege to welcome to the show Margaret Andrews. Margaret, welcome to Beyond the To-Do List.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Yeah. So what's funny is, so you've got a brand new book out. It's called Manage Yourself to Lead Others. That makes sense. Why Great Leadership Begins with Self-Understanding. And you're speaking my language right there. But some people are thinking, okay, this is a productivity show. That's focusing on getting things done. You argue that what makes us effective, which is another, honestly, bigger part of productivity, because we talk about all the different dynamics of productivity, that what makes you effective shifts when you move into leadership. What changes when the job stops being about your own output and starts being about the output and the leading of others?
Yes. So a couple of things. One is that I oftentimes think that people confuse efficiency with effectiveness, right? And so it's actually easy to be efficient. It's harder to be effective. By the same token, I feel that a lot of times we have to sort of slow down to speed up. And stopping, or I'll say, taking really getting to know and understand yourself. If we don't understand ourselves, we can't manage ourselves. And if we don't understand ourselves, we can't really understand other people. When we start to go on this journey of self-understanding, we realize, my gosh, I'm actually quite different from other people, and that goes back to the way I was raised, the way I was educated, what my motivations are, etc. And so we understand that. And then when we are working with other people, we begin to understand, and they're all different too. And that is what makes a great team, is when you have people that are different from one another. If we take the time to get to know them, we get a more effective team. So we have to understand ourselves to understand other people. We have to understand ourselves to manage ourselves. And also, if we don't manage ourselves well, we have zero credibility in asking other people to up their game.
Well, and we live in this world that is obsessed with strategy and tactics and hacks. So you making the case that self-awareness is actually a leadership superpower makes sense, because it is one of those things that's overlooked. Why do you think so many leaders overlook this?
Because it's hard and it's messy. And sometimes when you look inside yourself, you see things you wish you didn't see. Kind of facing some of those things, realizing, hey, what was my contribution to that terrible situation? It's hard work, actually. Anybody who's ever done it would say, yeah, I'm really glad I did, but boy, it was difficult to do that. So I think, and I don't want to say it's laziness, because it's not laziness. A lot of times it's kind of anxiety and fear, or also, hey, everything is working just fine right now. If it ain't broke, why fix it, kind of thing. And very much, I oftentimes get people in my executive programs where they're kind of thinking that, but realizing, oh, maybe I'm a little closer to being broke than I think I am.
Yeah. Well, and you talk about this in the book. You've written that a boss once told you flat out that you weren't self-aware. And that's a pretty tough thing to hear. Can you take us back to that moment, how that set you on this path that became this book?
Sure, absolutely. So I was working in a job where I was, by all measures, doing quite well and had a boss and had a wonderful relationship. And that boss left and I had a new one. And I will say that we did not gel the same way that I had with my previous boss. And so it was tough. It was tough going. And one day, sitting across from me in one of our one-on-ones, he looked at me point blank and said, you're not self-aware. And it was said in not a very kind, let me help you kind of way. It was said in a, you are broken and cannot be fixed kind of way. So I was pretty stunned, pretty taken aback. And, he went on to say, you're overly ambitious and, you don't understand how you come across to others. That was really hard to hear. And I was experiencing what I'll call a cocktail of emotions, not very good ones either. It was embarrassment, anger, defensiveness, frustration, probably 25 others as well. So, I sat there, but when I really thought about it later, after I calmed down, and it took a while, I realized that he was right. And that was the hardest part of the story, because I had really good strategic and operational skills, which had been rewarded my entire career. But then as I was leading a lot more people, that you reach the limit of those because your work is increasingly done with and through other people. And the more I thought about it, I have these good strategic and operational skills, but my interpersonal skills and my relationships, some of them, not all of them, were underperforming. I had a couple people on my team that I think were pretty anxious and might have felt underappreciated. And the relationship I had with my boss was clearly underperforming. And that was not what I wanted. That was not anywhere close to my intention. But I realized, but it is the results. And I had a lot to do with these results. So at that point, I thought, I do not want this to be the end of the story. So I started doing research in, for any kind of insight I could get on this. And so I started off looking at famous leaders as well as people I knew, academic studies, management books, history, philosophy, psychology, anything that I could get my hands on that might help. And so what I found was that so many things were pointing in the same direction. And that is, you have to understand and manage yourself before you can lead others. So that was really the impetus of it, was to fix my own situation. And I told some people about it and they were interested in it. And years later, I created a class and it's become very, very popular, has a wait list every time it's offered. And then years later, I created an executive program of the same name, and that does well. It's now the most popular executive program at Harvard. So that's how it started.
In the book, you talk about how leadership is less about intelligence and technical skills, and it's much more, in fact, about interpersonal skills. I think for some people that's maybe bad news because that they feel shell shocked by, but I'm good at my job and I am a great leader, but they know they don't really have the interpersonal skills. And so they feel like they're maybe lacking in that area. Why is it that you believe or say that interpersonal skills are really the key here for leadership?
They are the superpower. So I will tell you that it does come as a shock to some people. It's not just me that says this. It's literally thousands of people that I've worked with over almost the past 20 years. I have this exercise that I use in most of my programs, and I ask people to think about their very best boss. So they think about it, and I say, just one person, get that person in mind. Now, think of all the reasons why that person is your best boss. The big reasons, the small reasons, the reasons that only you think are, you would have. And I say, go for a long list. So they do that. And then I say, okay, now go back and circle the top three or highlight whatever. And then I have them put it on a Post-it note. We put the Post-it notes in these three buckets. The first bucket is intelligence, meaning that, one of your reasons was that this person was just super smart. The second bucket is around hard skills or technical and functional skills. And, that they were good at whatever it was, data science, surgery, whatever it was. The third bucket is around interpersonal skills. And these are everything from they saw something in me and really developed it, or, they challenged me and supported me appropriately, whatever, these kinds of things. But when people see what the results of the room is, that third bucket is overwhelmingly overrepresented. And so several years ago, I started keeping track of, that always happens, right? Always, always. And I thought, well, what percentage of those Post-it notes are on that third board versus the other two? And so as I tracked it, it turns out that 85% on average are on that third board, and the remaining 15% are split pretty evenly between the IQ and these technical and functional skills. And so what that is saying is not that intelligence and the hard skills are unimportant, right? So some people say, well, how can that be? And I say, that's not what it's saying. What it's saying is that the plus factor, the difference between a good boss and a great boss, is the interpersonal skills. And, lots of times, people come up to me afterwards and talk about it. And one of my favorite comments that somebody said was, yeah, that person helped me grow and glow. And I thought, yeah, that's what really great leaders do for you. So it's not just me saying that. It's pretty much everybody I've ever worked with says that.
Now, you've also said that leaders aren't remembered for being best practices, but for being a best practice. Unpack that for us.
Yeah, really, I think it's the same thing. That best boss exercise that I do, that person was the best practice for them. It was the way they interacted with them. In fact, I'll ask people after we run that exercise, would you work for this person again if given the opportunity and things like that? And I see a sea of heads nodding yes. And, I ask them, do you think this person understood themselves pretty well? Yes. Do you think this person managed themselves pretty well? More nodding yes. Do you think this person understood you as an individual? More nodding yes, right? But that's the point, is that this person not only understood and managed themselves well, but really understood that person as well and took the time to develop them. So that's what really makes a great boss, and they are the best practice.
Now, you talk about leadership growth being like an S curve. How does that model change the way that we currently think about learning new skills?
Yeah. So, I think that when we are learning something new, that we oftentimes think that, if you take the x-axis is time and the y-axis is performance, that we think that, hey, over time we get better. There's this kind of linear line. And it turns out that while we do get better over time, it doesn't look like that at all. It looks a little bit more like an S curve where you get better slowly and then quickly, and then you taper off. And the idea is that when you're learning something new, you don't even know what success looks like, right? You don't know how to do it, all of these things. So you look around, you find out who's good at this. Is there a book I can read? Is there a podcast I can listen to or something like that? And then as you go through, you make a lot of mistakes as you're doing it, and you correct that mistake and have a more informed attempt the next time. So you get better, as I say, slowly and then quickly. Then you level off. And that's when it's time as a leader to say, okay, what's my next S curve? What am I going to tackle next? And that is actually how we get better over time.
One of the things that I think high achievers struggle with when they hear, again, it's one of those shell shock moments, is, but I'm so good at everything. How can I not be good at self-awareness or these interpersonal, skill sets, these soft skills, so to speak? And they struggle with that. The vulnerability, it's because they're a beginner again. Why do you think they struggle like that?
I oftentimes think it's not that they say I'm so good at everything. I think that what they say, at least to me, is that I'm just not good at that. I'm a really good data scientist, but these interpersonal skills thing, not my bag, kind of thing. And what I will say is, yeah, you're just not good at them yet, but you can get better. So some people are naturally a little bit better at them than others, but that doesn't mean that all of us can't get better. And that's, I think, really what it's all about. They're just not good at it yet.
What do you think are some of the maybe warning signs or indicators that a leader is plateauing or worse, that they're maybe heading towards a derailment of sorts?
Yeah. So, the thing is that sometimes there aren't a lot of warning signs. Hemingway had in one of his books, there was an explanation of how does a person go bankrupt? And he said something like, well, slowly, then all at once. And I think that that is oftentimes how a career derailment happens, is that you are doing really well. And you do have some of these things that people might say, oh, gosh, we should talk to that person about this. If they're doing so well in these other areas, we'll just look the other way. But then over time, what happens is some of those behaviors actually start getting in the way. And one of the things you asked about early warning signs is high turnover. When you have high turnover on your team, that is an indication that something is wrong. And in fact, I would say in a large organization, if you look to where there's highest turnover, I'll show you where the managers that probably aren't so good are hanging out. So it's a lot of times, the high turnover can be a sign, but a lot of times it doesn't show up until the derailment has happened, when the promotion is denied or the firing happens, and lots of cases of that. And the thing about a derailment is that very oftentimes these people are extremely smart, and they're really good at those technical and functional skills, but they didn't do well in some of those interpersonal skills. Those are the things that actually matter more as you advance in your career.
And that would then leave them open to, and actually this may be a good connection for those high achievers who think they're great at data. Well, you say that emotions are data, so that's a good maybe transition for them or entry point for them. But you say that emotions are data. How can leaders learn then to interpret their emotional signals?
Yeah. So it was actually Susan David who talks about emotions being data. And the thing is that they're oftentimes there to keep us alive, that we're here as human beings and as a species because we do have emotions. We think of them as being positive or negative, but in truth, all emotions are there to give us data to help us understand our surroundings. Anger, which is something that most of us don't really care much to feel, is actually there to give you that energy to push through a boundary or a setback or a boundary has been crossed. Fear is there to alert you to your surroundings so that you can potentially take yourself out of danger. So, it's stopping ourselves occasionally to just ask ourselves, what am I feeling right now? And one of the biggest tests of how well you understand your own emotions in the moment is if you can answer the question, who knows that you're angry first? Is it you or the person you're with? Because if it's you, that's a good sign of self-understanding, of being aware of your emotions in the moment. If it's the other person, you may have already done some damage to the relationship by the time you figured that out.
I think that's one of the keys there, is that oftentimes you're only good at this stuff by being good at this stuff, by practicing. You don't.
Yes.
It's only by making the mistakes and then self-reflecting and realizing and retroactively having the 2020 vision, so to speak, that you then can kind of prepare and do it better the next time, unfortunately.
Yes.
So one of the things that people talk about when they talk about self-awareness, self-reflection, again, it's lumped into this thing called soft skills. Why do people, people say it's soft, like that's not, something that is, powerful or whatever you want to call it. Soft seems weak. How do we reframe this as a powerful productivity and leadership tool?
Yeah. I do go back to that best boss, and I would ask anybody who's listening, think about your best boss. Very likely they had some pretty good interpersonal skills. We can call them superpowers or soft skills, relationship skills, interpersonal, emotional intelligence. They go by lots of names. But the thing is, they're very effective. The people that we listen to. And it doesn't, by the way, mean that our best boss didn't give us some tough feedback, because it's actually very oftentimes kind for somebody to give us that feedback.
Yeah. And actually thinking about that, some of my best bosses actually embody or lived out some of the things that I remember coming across in the book that you explain as, they have this They have a gravitas to them, but they're not overbearing. They have a power to them, but they're not exerting it over you so much as they are using it to empower you. They may have something to say, and they may even be upset or disappointed, but they aren't using it to berate you. In other words, they would use things like the pause technique, for example. Explain a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think a lot of times doing is they'll ask you first, right? They are actually helping you to become more self-aware. I can think back to a time when I was working in consulting earlier in my career, and I came out of a meeting when the partner asks me later, he says, so Margaret, how do you think the meeting went? And I said, I think it went well. And then he said, and how do you think you did in the meeting? And of course, I'm thinking, well, I don't know how to answer this. And the reason is because I didn't say much in that meeting. I said, I think I'm fine. And he said, right. He said, you should know that this client is paying a lot of money for us to help him solve this problem. And he said, he's going to make up his mind about what he thinks about you and the value that you bring to this team by what you say in meetings. And he said, you didn't say anything really of substance in that meeting. So he probably has a big question mark in his head at this moment about the value you bring to this team. And, the way he did that was actually very helpful. I absolutely heard what he said. I felt kind of what he probably wanted me to feel was, oof, that wasn't what I wanted. But then, he gave me one of the best pieces of advice that I had ever received. And he said, hey, listen, I think you're an introvert, which I am. And he said, so this is going to be a little harder for you. But he said, before every meeting, he said, think of 3 points that you might make and 3 questions that you might make or ask in this meeting. And he said, launch into one of those early in the meeting and it will get you in the game. It will prime your pump. You'll be there. And so he could see the situation. He could see the problem. He had some ideas about how I could address it. And it was very effective in how he did that.
Yeah. It sounds like he was guiding questions more than giving orders.
Yeah, he was doing a combination of coaching and mentoring. He was pulling it out of me, but he was saying, hey, try this. And it worked very well.
Yeah, asking you the right questions so that you then came up with the answers. And then based on your answers, you were open to hearing his follow-up that would kind of course correct, so to speak.
Yeah. Well, and I also think too, that organization was a culture of feedback. So you got feedback all the time, after any client meeting or presentation or anything. And it was done well. They took the idea that people are our biggest assets quite seriously. And so when somebody said, hey, can I give you some feedback? The answer was yes, please, because it was meant to help you improve. And it was done very well. And I think that was a great place to work because there was a sense that everybody wanted to improve. If I improve, it improves our team, it improves our results, et cetera. And that's not true in every organization. In fact, I think a lot of organizations, when somebody says, hey, I want to give you some feedback, people sort of wince or they get into the defensive crouch knowing what might be coming.
Mm-hmm. One of the other things that strikes me is the way that this interplays with one of the most common things we've had happen in more recent years in people's careers is this remote work factor. And so there's been this factor of autonomy. And in the book, you talk about a leader who actually, not because of remote work, but overall just loosened their control, I guess, over a team. And then they found that the productivity and morale skyrocketed. Talk to that a little bit.
Yeah, I think that the idea that we have to be command and control, which a lot of times, we still think of that as being what leadership is. I'm decisive and I have a certain bearing and my voice is deep or whatever it is, right? But we have this sense of what it is. But, if you hire really smart people, they're going to figure stuff out. And a lot of times they're going to figure stuff out better than you can, or they're going to come up with a different or better way of doing things. So I think sometimes when we stop monitoring it so closely, things actually do get better on the team.
Obviously, this isn't all about being a leader per se, as it pertains to you're in charge and you lead those that are beneath you, so to speak, or a lower level. Beneath is not probably the best way to put it. But this also goes the other way as well. You can lead those that are higher up than you, as you talk about with the chapter of managing up. And that's hard to hear also, I think. We often think, well, I can't change them, or, they're not going to be different and I can't do anything about it. But often we still have a bit of our own kind of stakes in the restrained relationship, if there is one.
Yeah. I mean, the whole idea of managing up is really taking some responsibility for the relationship. If you're my boss, if I think of you as a partner, that may be more effective as opposed to me thinking of you as the boss and me as a subordinate. You say jump and I say how high, right? Maybe I'm asking you, oh, what are we trying to do here? Is jumping really the best way to do it? Maybe we should do it a different way. And there's lots of examples of that in the book. But I think that one of the most effective ways is to really think like a partner. And if you have a boss that you have a difficult relationship with, or an employee that you have a difficult relationship, one of the first things to do is to look in the mirror, because what are we potentially doing that is exacerbating the situation? Because if you think about a boss-subordinate relationship, it's two people that are involved in it. So they're, one person is doing one thing, another person is doing another. So, really looking at it from that perspective. And am I actually trying to be a partner to this person? And if you think about what a partner does, is you don't let your partner fail, right? You might tell your partner things that they need to hear, even if they don't necessarily want to hear it. And, if you may have been in this situation too, but sometimes you need somebody on your team that will come in and tell you the things that no one else will, about what the team is saying or how they're feeling or something like that. That is thinking like a partner.
Many leaders see managing up as playing politics. How do you reframe it as a positive leadership skill?
To me, it's a relationship. It's a slightly different relationship, right? Because there are different power dynamics going on in that one than, say, with your teammates or something like that. But, I don't know. I don't think I'd necessarily call it politics, but I would say, if you and I are going to work together, a big part of that's going to be on me. So what can I understand about you and how you work, how you like to be communicated with? I oftentimes would ask a new boss, tell me about yourself. How do you like to communicate? What do you want to hear from me and how often? And lots of times they had never been asked these things. So they struggled to answer them. And I said, you don't have to answer them now, but, maybe next time we talk, just tell me what you think. And I oftentimes would ask them too, what am I going to do that's going to really upset you or make you angry? I remember I had one of the very best bosses I ever had. He said, don't surprise me. Don't let anything surprise me. And I thought, okay, I can do my very best with that. So we had a way of working where if anything could potentially go sideways, I just let him know about it. Say, hey, here's the situation that's going on. Here's what we're doing about it. I don't think it's going to, reach your office. And it rarely did, but every now and then it would. But he was aware of it, and he was not surprised, and he could back me up. And then that boss left and another one took over. And of course I did the same thing. And so I called him one time. I said, hey, just want to let you know this is happening. Here's what we're doing, et cetera. And there was just silence on the end of the line. And he said, why are you telling me this? And I said, I said, I thought you'd want to know just in case, something went sideways. So he said, no, I don't want to know that. He said, I just want you to fix it. And I thought, okay, same boss, not the same as the old boss, right? So asking, that was really what got me to ask what people wanted.
Yeah, man. Obviously, part of this journey and this process is knowing that setbacks are inevitable in leadership. I know that you talked about an experience you had of being passed over for a promotion and kind of how you reframed that. Could you share a little bit about that?
Yeah. So actually that wasn't my story, but there are others like that in the book. But, the whole idea of a setback is that I always say that, if you're an ambitious person, which in my mind is a good thing, you will have setbacks, because if you're trying something new or you're trying something big, that you haven't done before, you're going to make missteps. You're going to make mistakes and you will have setbacks. And that is just kind of part of life. But the big part of it, I think, is really looking at accepting reality. What just happened? What was your potential role in that? It's not asking about why this happened. What I'm really saying is what just happened and what is the same, what is different. And then the second part of it is to really think about what in this current situation now, after whatever setback just happened, can I do that will influence the situation at this point? And by this, I mean making a list of what is in my control and what is outside of my control, and just focusing on what is in your control. I had one time where somebody told me, the one thing I can control during this period is I can decide whether to take a shower today or not. I'm like, yes, that's exactly what I'm talking about, right? If it's going to make you feel better, go take a shower. So those are some of the things. But one of the other things is looking for these hidden things. There is a story in the book about somebody who started a business and it was doing pretty well. They were actually going to sell it and the check didn't come through. The wire transfer for the funds did not come through. And his partner called him and said, I don't know what's going on. Well, it turned out it was the day that Lehman Brothers collapsed. And it was the beginning of the financial crash. And so he said, this was just the beginning of a terrible period in his life. That sale didn't go through. They had to sell it more at a fire sale. And he said, he had never been kicked that way before. And he said, as he was kind of recovering from it, he realized, I started this business. I don't really have any strong affinity to this industry that I started it in. But he said, I actually do have a strong affinity for industries that really help people transform their lives or live better lives. And he said, that means healthcare and education. So he said, my next startup is going to be in one of those too. Well, anyway, he now runs one of the biggest ed tech startups in the world right now. And he will say this wouldn't have happened had that first one not failed and he had to go through all of that. So oftentimes, a setback can be a fork in the road. It could be the end of one road and the start of another. But it's all what we make of it at the time.
Yeah. And you talk about leadership being a lifelong practice. How do you encourage leaders to stay committed to growth over the long haul?
Yeah. And I think that's hard because you get your reward for doing this well is more work or more responsibility. But you have to take time to yourself, whether it's reflection time, making sure that you're exercising and these kinds of things. But I always loved the story about Andy Grove at Intel, that they were faced with at one point a changing market. And he asked one of his partners, he said, if the board fired us right now and they hired somebody new, what's the first thing that new person would do? And they talked about it and said, that's what we should do then. So they symbolically fired themselves. They went down the elevator, took off their badges, went out, came back in, put on their badges, came up the elevator again, and that's what they did. So I just thought that was such a great way of thinking of, instead of saying, well, I built this, I have to keep going in this direction. Sometimes, look at the world is changing in all kinds of different ways. So what we've built over the past 10, 20 years or something like that may need a big pivot. So better that we find that pivot than somebody exploits that weakness.
Yeah. Margaret, it's been great talking with you. Obviously, there's a lot more in the book than what we talked about here and now, but managing yourself, which is a huge deal, and then leading others, neither one of these are short, sweet, simple concepts that you could take a lifetime to grow yourself and lead others better. I'd love to point people to where they can, one, grab the book, two, stay in touch, find out all the other things that you're working on that are associated with it, and then connect with you.
Oh, excellent. Thank you. Well, the book, Manage Yourself to Lead Others, is available wherever you buy books. So whether it's Amazon, your local bookstore, Barnes & Noble, wherever. The best way to connect with me is through LinkedIn. That's the one social media I use the most. And I am Margaret C. Andrews, C as in cat. It turns out that there are lots of Margaret Andrews. It turns out there are even 2 Margaret Andrews at Harvard. So the other one is in the classics department. So I always know when an email is sent to me by mistake. So LinkedIn, and then also my website, which is margaretandrews.com with no C on that one.
Perfect. And I will make sure to link all those up in the show notes for the episode so people can find them easily. Margaret, thank you so much for sharing your insight, your expertise, and making this hard yet soft topic approachable.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you having me here. It's been a great conversation.
Well, that's another podcast crossed off your listening to-do list. I hope that you enjoyed listening in on this conversation with Margaret C. Andrews. And I hope that you have a greater understanding of self-understanding, or at least a better picture of where you're at with it. I know for me, this conversation brought up a few great reminders. I haven't shared this with a lot of people, but I'm working in an office again, as I've been working in an office again, and I haven't been doing that for 11 years now. I was remote for so long, and I've been working in an office pretty often. And so some of the ways that this stuff works out in those in-person settings is different than in a remote setting. And I had forgotten that. But I really hope that you got something great out of this. And if you did, I would love for you to share it with somebody that you know needs to hear it. Hit that share button wherever you're at, listening to this in your podcast player app of choice, or head on over to the show notes at beyondthetodolist.com and share it from there. Thank you so much for sharing. Thanks again for listening, and I will see you next episode.